Welcome to the 7th episode of Apple Finch Pudding, your gateway into the world of science. Today's co-host is Ahmad Fuadi, the internationally acclaimed Indonesian author of The Land of Five Towers, the first book of a trilogy which has been turned into a moving picture. Our scientist for today is Teresa Gimeno, a researcher at the Basque Centre for Climate Change and CREAF. To be honest, I'm happy we were able to record this episode at all, as Teresa is heavily pregnant. So welcome, Ahmad and Teresa. Teresa, how are you doing? Your due date is in about 2 weeks, so very exciting times for you.
Yeah, that's right. Very, very excited. And it's our first baby, so everything is new and exciting. So looking forward to it.
And Ahmad, exciting times for you as well. Like I said in my introduction, your first novel has been turned into a movie, but your second novel of the trilogy has now been turned into a movie as well. How was that process for you? Did you enjoy the making of the movie?
I'm actually the outsider of the movie makers team. I read the novel and they turn it into a movie. It was exciting to be on the sideline to see how they are busy making movie out of my book. And actually, I went to Belgium 3 years ago, maybe near your house, I don't know, during the filming process to film my second book. And now the movie in Indonesia is called Ranah Tiga Warna, is on theater right now. So I'm, very happy with the final product.
And how would you translate that title?
The Land of Three Colors.
The Land of Three Colors.
Yes.
So hopefully that gets translated in English soon as well.
Hopefully. And the first movie was being produced 10 years ago. And this week is available on Netflix Indonesia. I don't know whether it's globally, but for now in Indonesia.
Okay, so people, you can try to check it out on Netflix. My first question is actually always the same. I always ask for a science joke or an anecdote or a fun fact. So I will start with Teresa. Do you have something for us?
Yeah, I've been thinking of what could I share with your listeners. And I've actually opted for a bit of a personal story, but a funny one, don't you worry. You mentioned earlier that we're expecting our first kid, and this is super exciting times. And I met my husband thanks to science, actually. So when I was about to move to Australia for my first international postdoc, I was interviewing and super nervous because, I'm surrounded by a bunch of scientists that are super experts in the field, people I admire, and they're right in front of me interviewing me and asking me questions interested about my career. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so exciting. And at the end of the interview, there are a bunch of science and technical questions. They asked me, are you afraid of heights? I'm like, no, I'm not. And that took me by surprise, for sure. And then I asked, why are you asking that? It's like, because in this position, you'd be required to go up on a crane and access the treetops where you would be doing measurements. And don't you worry, there will be a person driving the crane there with you and everything will be safe. But we got to make sure that you're not afraid of heights. And like, no, not a problem. Not afraid of heights. And then I hung up. This was an online interview. And I told my colleague, a very good colleague of mine from the lab where I did my PhD, I'm like, can you believe they asked me this? And then she said, it's like, oh, you better get along with whoever is driving that crane. And then I moved to Australia, got the job, super happy about that. A few months went by and I called my friend. It's like, remember? You told me about getting along with the person driving the crane? Yeah, I'm going out with him.
Well, you got along.
And now he's my husband. And now we're expecting our first baby. And it's super exciting.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
Well, you did listen to your friend.
Yeah, I definitely did. She's a great scientist.
Yeah. And Ahmad, do you also have something for us?
Yeah, since I was contacted by you and you asked me to prepare question for scientists, I start to feel guilty as a writer, Why? Because every time I write a book and the book will be published, it will be printed on paper. And I wonder how book printing actually contribute to the loss of forests, if any. So I look up on the internet the relationship between, printing a book and loss of forests. I don't know whether this one is quite scientifically based on scientific research or not, but in one of the website, I found out that one tree can produce paper for 60 books. So how many tree being cut to make my book actually? So some of my books are national bestseller. So say I have 500,000 copies published. much. So if we roughly calculate it, I actually already cut 50,000 trees. How's that? So I hope both of you can shed some lights to make me feel less guilty, whether it's true or not. So that's, I don't know whether it's a story or a question for you.
Well, that's a very intriguing thought.
Yeah, it is. I think it also depends a lot on the trees that you're cutting down, like the size of the tree. Also, paper can be recycled, I think, 7 times. So if you use recyclable paper, that could also more or less reduce the impact of your book.
I would also argue it depends heavily on where those trees come from.
Yeah,
If they're sustainably harvested, that would make a big difference.
right. That's good news to make me feel less guilty.
Okay.
I have a hint of less good news adding to what Jeroen was saying. It's like, sure, you can recycle paper, but actually sometimes in terms of CO2 emissions to the atmosphere, it's more sustainable to cut a tree to make new paper.
Really?
It all comes down to where you're harvesting those trees from, how those trees were grown, from where to where you're going to be moving that wood to turn it into paper, and so on and so forth. How are you dealing with all the chemical products that you use to then transform that wood into paper? So it's not a simple answer, I would say, but definitely bookmaking, for sure, it's something to think about. But regarding the way we manage our forest, it's maybe not our biggest worry. I much rather continue reading on paper.
Yeah, I prefer paper as well.
Me too.
And actually, maybe that's just a comforting idea. But I have heard people argue when you buy wooden products like furniture or books that are wood derived and it's done in a sustainable way, like it's harvested from a forest and it can regrow, that you're actually creating some kind of carbon sink in your house because you're keeping that carbon there.
Well, I definitely like the concept. It's something I had never picture in my head in that way. But yeah, I guess I have a pretty strong carbon sink at my home in the shape of a good book collection, which I am very fond of. But also, I think something like books, which is so meaningful and something that you can lend to a friend, you can share it with your family. I don't know. I have the feeling that stocking up books is probably not a bad way of keeping carbon at your own home if you are cutting off emissions elsewhere, which is a lot more meaningful when it comes down to mitigating climate change.
And I also have actually a small fact for today. So most people have some kind of idea of what tectonic plates are. Basically, Earth's crust is divided in plates which can move according to each other. They can go towards each other and create volcanoes and stuff. They can move away from each other and create some kind of new, younger Earth crusts. They can move sideways. But another result of that is that on average, Hawaii is moving about 7.5 centimeters closer to Alaska every year.
That is interesting. It could counterbalance the impact of global warming. In the meantime, as you're moving further north, your temperature increase could be mitigated slightly by that.
So, Teresa, you work at the Basque Climate Change Center, but climate change is a broad term. So, in what general field do you work in?
So, from the more general to the more specific, I am a plant scientist. So, I study how the vegetation works and how it interacts with the atmosphere and the soil that supports all the vegetation. And more specifically, I'm a plant ecophysiologist. So I study the processes that make plants work, like how they take up carbon, how they use water, how they take up nutrients, how they interact with other organisms, mainly fungi and microbes. They also interact with animals, for example, but I don't delve into that much.
So the interactions of plants with their environment and how they function.
Mm-hmm.
And more specific in that field, what do you do? What is your research?
The bulk of my research focuses on how carbon and water are exchanged between plants and the atmosphere. So there's CO2 out there that plants need to take up to then turn that CO2 into sugars, which then they turn into wood and everything else that constitutes the plant, everything else that we're later going to eat. All animals on Earth, we feed on plants either directly or indirectly. And I study how that process is dependent on water and how much water plants use to take up a certain amount of CO2 and turn it into biomass of wood or other parts of the plant. Because to take up that CO2, plants need to open some little pores that they have on their leaves. Most plants have these pores. Other plants don't, like mosses, for example. They don't have these pores. And they're similar to our skin that has pores through which we sweat. So we lose water and we need to drink water to replenish and not dehydrate. Well, plants are kind of the same. Unfortunately for them, they need to keep those pores open to allow CO2 to go into the leaf and then have enough CO2 available to do photosynthesis. And in that photosynthesis, there's a very convenient byproduct for us, which is oxygen.
Very convenient.
Yes.
Just as a side question, so you said mosses don't have those pores. Then how do they lose water or absorb carbon dioxide?
That is very unfortunate for mosses and other non-vascular plants. We call non-vascular plants those plants that don't have vessels to conduct the water. And that includes mosses, but also liverworts, which are kind of like crusty mosses that look a little bit like soft sponges that sometimes we see in very wet spaces, like next to fountains or cascades. They'll be hiding and creating a really nice mosaic of bright greens. But since they don't have these pores that have the ability to open and close to regulate a little bit the loss of water, they're just exposed to whatever the environment is doing. So if it's hot and dry outside, they're going to lose water and eventually they're going to dehydrate. So their only strategy to avoid that is using morphologic adaptations. For example, having leaves that are able to curl and protect themselves from losing water and stay all tiny wrapped. But those are evolutionary adaptations. They don't work on an immediate time frame.
And how does the CO2 enter then? Because they can lose water. CO2 enters in the same way?
Yeah, exactly. So when those pores are open, CO2 simply diffuses from the atmosphere into the leaf. The leaf has a little airspace underneath that pore. And then when that CO2 reaches that airspace, it will travel from that little airspace through the walls of the cells, through the membranes, through the chloroplast, until it reaches the factory where the magic happens, photosynthesis. And that's where CO2 gets turned into sugars using the energy from the sun.
And those mosses, they absorb CO2 not through these pores because they don't have them?
Exactly. So CO2 has to diffuse through their epidermis. Well, not epidermis. They don't have an epidermis as we do or as other plants do. They simply have a layer of cells. So CO2 has to diffuse through this layer of cells into the same spaces where the same magic happens. It's just that the path is slightly different.
Just to explain, so epidermis is the outermost layer of cells, and diffusion is just the dispersal of atoms. Like if you have a gas leak, it moves away throughout the entire space. That's diffusion, right?
Exactly. So it's mainly a gradient movement. So CO2 is going to be moving from where there's a lot of it to where there's much less CO2. And that's basically it. But there needs to be a gateway. And for example, most plants on their leaves, they have a layer of cells. That's the epidermis. And those cells are tightly packed. And on top of that, they're covered by wax. So the whole point is to avoid losing water, but also that will not allow CO2 to go in. So you're going to have to use the bottom of the leaf, which is where most plants have those pores and where it's not as sunny and dry, to access these little spaces from which the CO2 will travel and reach the machinery.
So the top layer of the leaf that has most contact with sunlight is actually covered by a waxy layer. We can maybe loosely compare it to candle wax to avoid water from leaving, but that also avoids CO2 of getting in. So it has to go through the pores at the bottom of the leaf.
Yeah.
And so you focus both on the water and the CO2 streams. Maybe we'll start with the CO2. The CO2 gets into the leaf, like you said. It gets into the pores that are in the leaves. There's a hollow space there. And then it diffuses to the cells, to the chloroplasts, the factories you mentioned where photosynthesis happens. And then what? What happens next?
So you've basically described the whole trip that CO2 will experience after it crosses these pores that are called stomata, by the way. So once it reaches the chloroplast, there it's going to encounter an enzyme. An enzyme, it's a protein that makes certain chemical reaction occur at a pace that otherwise wouldn't occur. And this enzyme uses that molecule of CO2 to then make sugar. And that's something that no other enzyme can do. It's amazing. And it's the most abundant enzyme on the planet.
Really?
Yes.
And that's where all the sugars in the plant come from.
Mm-hmm.
And what does the plant do with those sugars?
Well, first of all, it's going to feed its most immediate needs. Let's say, for example, you have cells on your leaves that are respiring and growing and expanding. Well, those sugars are going to be immediately used. But that's usually a very, very small portion. Most of those sugars get exported to other parts of the plant. So plants don't have a heart like most animals do, but they do have a vascular system. They kind of have veins and arteries in a way.
Like the veins you see in a leaf.
Yeah, exactly. And through those veins, you have both the water feeding the leaves, but you also have sugar contents traveling the other way around, being exported from the leaves all the way into the wood, other leaves that may be growing at that time, fruits that are going to be producing, or for example, if it's the end of the summer, you're going to be storing sugars in the form of starch for the winter. And you'll be exporting that, for example, into the trunk where you have certain storage compartments.
So the plant or the tree actually prepares for winter by storing food to bridge winter time.
Absolutely. Yeah. They can put on weight.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, most of them have developed strategies to conserve their most valuable resources, for example, nitrogen and phosphorus. Like plants that are deciduous, like a lot of forests in our temperate latitudes are dominated by deciduous forests.
Deciduous means that they lose their leaves in winter, right?
Correct. There's also plants, and I know that Ahmed lives in a more tropical part of the world. There's also deciduous species in tropical regions, but they actually drop their leaves for a different reason. It's because they lack water. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to drop my leaves. I'll wait until the next wet season.
So then it's not related to temperature, but to water availability.
It's related to both, actually. Plants have sensors that can track both temperature and, very important, light, the quality of light. We've all noticed that towards the end of the summer, the light changes. It's not just the temperature. We look outside and it has a different haze. It feels different. You feel like autumn is coming in our temperate latitudes. And that's because the ratios of red infrared radiation that we receive from the sun are changing. And plants sense that. And they're like, oh, hold on, winter is coming.
And then they start to prepare.
Yeah. I was actually very curious when Ahmed said the title of his book, the translation into English, The Color of the Trees. Why is that? Where does that come from?
Well, one of the setting of the novel is in Quebec, Canada, during fall. So that's the foliage of the maple tree. But not only that, because the main setting of the novel are three places: Indonesia, Jordan, and Canada. So each place has a color identity. So Indonesia, a tropical country, Jordan is in the Middle East, and Canada, North America. So there are several layers to translate the title of the book, and also the adventure in three different lands.
Oh, that's fascinating.
This connected to the discussion because it's about plants and the color of the plants, and it's about the fall, when they shed their leaves before winter.
And your books are loosely based on your own life. So you have been to all those places?
Yeah. I spent 3 months as a youth exchange program participant in Quebec.
So when you were in Quebec, you saw all those different plants and colors of leaves. Is that a big part of your novel?
Well, for us as people from tropical country, changing the leaf during every season is quite special. So for me, it's an amazing experience. So the situation becomes the background of the novel. The storyline is there, but the background of the story during the fall, I mentioned several times about the changing color, the foliage and everything.
Because something that a lot of people forget, that it can be quite different in different parts of the world. For example, in temperate regions, we are used to trees having tree rings, but not all tropical trees, for example, have tree rings. So you cannot determine age based on tree rings in the tropics. And yeah, for example, in your case, you're not used to that much coloring of the leaves in fall, I imagine. So yeah, it's really interesting that it's different in different parts of the world.
It's true that most tropical tree species don't form rings, but there's very smart researchers out there that have still figured out ways of dating trees using wood slices or wood cores by looking at, for example, the signature of the rain. Because obviously water is water, H2O, and you drink it and it's just water. But in water, there's different concentrations, different ratios of stable isotopes of hydrogen and oxygen. So stable isotopes are atoms of either hydrogen or oxygen that weigh a tiny little bit more, but they're stable. They're not radioactive. And that changes, for example, depending on where you are, how far you are from the sea. And that will have an imprint on the wood that it's formed, depending on what the rain is carrying.
Just to give a general idea, like you say, isotopes are different types of atoms of the same kind. Like you have hydrogen and deuterium. So hydrogen from water is 1 proton and 1 electron, and deuterium is 1 proton, 1 electron, and 1 neutron. That's why it's a little heavier, because it has a neutron. And then you can have tritium, which has another neutron. So it becomes heavier because it has neutrons, but that doesn't give it a charge. It stays the same atom.
Exactly.
And that changes in space and over time.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool that they use that. Do they have other ways to determine age that you know of?
Well, it's really tricky. I'm definitely amazed by the people that have figured out all the systems to date trees in tropical regions. For example, the size of the vessels. We were talking earlier about how plants don't have a heart, but they still have a vascular system. So the main part of their vascular system are their conductive vessels that in trees go up from the roots all the way to the leaves, the branches, and everything. So those vessels are bigger when there's a lot of water available, so that you can conduct a lot of water. You need a lot of water, you need a big pipe. But when you don't have much water available, then you make smaller vessels, because you don't want those vessels to be filled with air and become useless. So you're going to form smaller vessels. Yes, they're going to be less efficient, but they're safer, because if there's only a small amount of water available, they'll still be able to conduct some to the branches. Whereas if you had a bigger vessel, the likelihood of having an air bubble will be bigger. It's like when you're using a straw and then an air bubble forms in your straw, that's it, end of the game. Your milkshake, you're never going to finish it.
Water is being lost through the leaves. How does the water get replenished? So how does the water get to the leaf? And how come the plant is losing that much water?
Yeah, that's the biggest problem for plants, which is replenishing all that water. The vast majority of the water comes up from the soil, and it's taken up by plants through their roots. So plants need a well-developed root system that is either very, very deep or wide or dense, so that they can supply the demand of water on the leaves, because the demand of water on the leaves is going to be dependent on the temperature and the humidity up there. So if it's hot and dry, you're going to be losing a lot of water. Therefore, you're going to need to pump a lot of water from the soil. So this is what basically it's regulating the climate in so many regions of the world, because the amount of water that's being pumped from the soil through the trees back into the atmosphere through the leaves, it's what's regulating the climate, for example, in the Amazon. And going back to Ahmed's initial worries about the consequences of deforestation, we tend to think immediately on habitat loss, and that's a tragedy, obviously. Next usually comes the worry of carbon being released back into the atmosphere, further contributing to climate change. But there's a huge impact of actually getting rid of forested areas, which is related to climate regulation, because they're the biggest pumps on Earth, on land, obviously. I don't go into the ocean very often.
Because algae produce a lot of oxygen as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And the mechanisms are very, very similar. They don't have the pores that terrestrial plants have, because the diffusion of CO2, similar to what we were talking about in mosses. But yeah, they produce a huge amount of oxygen, obviously, and they deserve a lot more attention and care.
You have been talking about very scientific question and answer. I have a layman question, actually. From my country, again, from tropical countries perspective, we have so many coconut trees around. And listening to your research about plants and how they're effectively using water, why in this specific species, coconut tree, they pump up significant amount of water up to the peak of the tree, can be 5 meters high. So scientifically, what is the use of that amount of water up there inside the coconut tree? For us, of course, it's easy. It's to help us enjoying coconut water. But from scientific view, what is the reason?
Well, they provide a fantastic ecosystem service. There's no doubt of that. There's always a refreshing snack available. That's great. But although I do not have a certain answer for this, honestly, intuitively, from my background in biology and studying plants, it must be an evolutionary trait that is helpful for dispersal. So having water inside of you will make you attractive for dispersers. Therefore, they're going to take your coconut and bring it somewhere very far away from the mother tree. And that will, you'll be spreading your genes into much further regions.
If I'm not mistaken, a lot of coconuts float as well. So if they're higher up, they maybe have a bigger chance of falling in the sea or the ocean and move to another place or something.
To other islands.
Yeah. And it might also be evolutionary in the sense that when a coconut tree grows higher, it can be higher than other plants surrounding it and capture more light, which allows us to capture more carbon dioxide and do photosynthesis and create those sugars. So the height might be related to other plants around it as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a way of maximizing resources over your potential competitors, mainly light.
Interesting.
But actually, I think that the coconut tree that you're mentioning is an interesting plant because if I'm not mistaken, maybe you know, Teresa, it doesn't have secondary growth. It's leaves actually that are hardening or something.
Yeah. Well, there's different type of palm trees, but a lot of the palm trees are more related to, for example, grasses than actual trees. They don't form rings as such. We divide plants into plants that have a vascular system, non-vascular system. Then within plants that have vascular systems, we have plants with flowers and plants without flowers. And then within plants with flowers, we have monocots and dicots, depending on the number of leaves that come out of the seed for the first time. And the vast majority of plants in temperate regions, for example, that form forests are dicots. They have 2 of these leaves. But palm trees are monocots. They have a totally different growth pattern, different way of transporting water, much different anatomy of their quote unquote wood. They're fascinating, but I can definitely assure you that they're not trees in the same way that we look at our temperate forest, our maple, our beech trees, or even conifer trees, which are different to those. They have much different patterns.
Another question, again, coming from the person without any scientific basis for biology and everything. It's been a talk during, tea time and everything. When you want to grow your plants at home, talk to your plant, sing to your plant. Some other people say, hug your plant or hug your tree. So I'm curious whether there is any scientific basis if you talk or if you interact with plants, it helps the plant.
Going back to the same idea of like plants don't have a heart as such, but they still have a vascular system. Same way plants don't have a central neural system, like they don't have a brain that will process that information, but they have sensors. They can sense light, not just how much there is, but also wavelengths and ratios of the different wavelengths. And sound is still a vibration. And there's certain studies out there that have proven that certain plants can actually sense certain frequencies of vibration. Now, whether that relates to talking to plants or playing music to plants to enhance growth, science definitely does not have a clear answer on that sense. But there's definitely ways plants can sense, quote unquote, sound, vibrations in a way. They don't sense it the same way we do. It's like that's a do, that's a re. So they sense the frequency and that's it. And they can also sense electricity as well. And they communicate.
How they communicate?
That's actually fascinating. Mostly through their fungal partners. It's like the internet of plants, I guess, in a way.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. So the vast majority of plants on land, they establish relationships with fungal partners. And those relationships, we call them symbiotic because they're beneficial for both the fungi and the plant. The fungi obtain sugars that are being exported from the plant into the soil through the roots and then feed the hyphae, the little hairs.
So the fungus is below the ground.
Yes, exactly. We immediately think of fungus and we think of a mushroom. Well, that's just the reproductive organ. The real important part is below ground. It's a very dense network of what we call hyphae that are very thin, well, or not necessarily that thin, hairs that establish connections, directly physical connections with the roots of the plants. And through those connections, then the plant feeds the fungi sugars, and the fungi then provides a much wider surface to absorb nutrients and to absorb water as well, but mainly nutrients. They also produce certain substances, enzymes, that, for example, if there are nutrients available in the soil, but they're not in a form that can be taken up by a plant, the fungi can make those available. They pre-digest them in a way so that the plant can absorb them. And through that hyphal network, through these hairs, they can communicate from one plant to another. They can even export resources. So it's like, look, I'm in a really good spot, lots of sunlight, lots of water. I'm producing a lot of sugars. And I have a sibling or a half sibling somewhere a few meters away that is in a very, very poor spot, not that much sunlight. He has other big trees shading it. I'm going to export some sugars through it. And I will use that fungal network to do that.
Wow, that's amazing. How do you detect the communication language of the plants?
For example, using stable isotopes.
So again, the atoms we mentioned before that are heavier than others, but are the same type of atoms.
Exactly. Yeah. So for example, we can feed the plants CO2 that is enriched with carbon that is slightly heavier. So the vast majority of the CO2 in the atmosphere, it's carbon 12. It has a molecular weight of 12. But there's a very small fraction of CO2 molecules that have carbon 13. They have an extra neutron, so they're slightly heavier. So if we feed our plants with an atmosphere that is, for example, very, very enriched in that CO2, that it's slightly heavier, then we can track that CO2 and see where it's going.
That actually brings me a little back to Ahmad's question. You talked about talking to your plants. And I also heard that it might have some effect because you're actually using carbon fertilization because you breathe out CO2 to your plant when you're standing close to it. And when carbon concentrations increase, plants grow better, not infinite, but at some point they do. So that might have some effect.
Unfortunately for us, it's true that photosynthesis and plant growth increases as CO2 concentration in the atmosphere increases, but we're reaching a plateau.
Yeah, it's not a solution for climate change. That's not what I meant.
Yeah, actually, a lot of the models in the early 2000s, for example, predicted that plants would be fantastic at just offsetting all that extra CO2 that we were putting out in the atmosphere as a result of fossil fuel burning. But we're seeing that that's not the case. Like, yeah, photosynthesis and plant growth has increased, but only to a certain extent, because first of all, this process eventually plateaus, but more importantly, plants are running out of water and nutrients, which are not being magically added to the atmosphere as CO2.
Can we grow more plants to disrupt the plateau?
Absolutely. Yeah. If we increase the amount of surface covered by vegetation, then that's an absolutely great solution to offsetting or partially offsetting CO2 emissions. Yes.
And actually, the effect of carbon dioxide being absorbed by plants is something you can see when you look at the global concentrations of carbon dioxide. Mm-hmm. Because when it's summer in the northern hemisphere, it's winter in the southern hemisphere and vice versa. And when you look at the CO2 concentrations over time, you actually can see like a sawtooth pattern. And when it's summer in the northern hemisphere, you have more plants there. And the CO2 concentration decreases a little because they are all absorbing the CO2. And when it's winter in the northern hemisphere, it increases a little because the southern plants are photosynthesizing, but they are less abundant than the northern part. So that's why you have that sawtooth pattern. So increase during the winter and decrease during the summer of the northern hemisphere. But in general, we still have the increase because of fossil fuels and stuff like that.
Do you have any plant that you recommend to plant more because they can absorb more CO2? Or can you improve the ability of a plant to absorb more carbon?
Actually, both strategies are plausible in a climate change scenario. On the one hand, we have the technology to engineer plants through molecular techniques, which is not my expertise, but we definitely can enhance how efficiently plants take up CO2 to make them, for example, more water use efficient, particularly on plants that are used for agriculture, wheat, tomatoes, rice. There's a huge amount of research and incredible research teams all over the world working on how to improve our crop varieties to make them more persistent and more efficient in a climate change scenario with more CO2, but with less water and warmer temperatures at the same time. So yes, for sure. That's one part that we're already working on. And as I said, we're pretty good at. It's amazing the advances we've witnessed in the past decade. And in the meantime, yes, absolutely, we can increase the amount of surface area on land covered by plants. That's a bit of a double-edged sword because, for example, there are actual companies that manufacture fossil fuels that are like, but don't worry, I'm planting forests in the meantime. It's like, yeah, but that's not enough.
It was also something you mentioned before, the trees or the plants influence the climate they live in. But I can imagine there's also a tipping point when there are not enough plants that they are not able to influence the climate anymore. Do you have some insights on that?
Yeah, actually, this brings me to one of my current research projects that I've been collaborating with. We've been studying how different forest types influence the local weather during heat waves. And this is something that we've experienced very recently in Europe. And obviously, heat waves are a huge problem for human health. They affect us in so many ways. And having trees close by can partially mitigate the negative impacts of a heat wave because they transpire and they cool down the local climate. However, that depends, first of all, on the fact of whether there's water in the soil or not. And second, on the type of trees you have nearby, because it's not the same having a beech forest or a pine forest nearby. The way these types of forests are going to regulate their water use is very, very different. We've been studying during specific heat wave periods in a small region in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula, how different types of forests responded to these heat wave periods, which ones were capable of mitigating the impact of the heat wave more or less. And definitely what we saw is that the amount of water available on the soil, it's absolutely crucial, but also the intensity of the heat wave. So it comes to a point when the heat wave is way too hot and way too dry, no matter what type of forest or how much water there's going to be available, you're not going to get much cooling effect from having forests.
And are you then talking only about forests close to a city? Or are you also talking about, for example, trees growing in a city?
We focused on forests that were big enough to see from a satellite. So this does not apply to, for example, a small mass of trees in a park in a city. But our conclusions are not far from what you would learn from, like, look, this type of trees are going to be more efficient or less efficient, and then help you design better and more sustainable cities.
And if you're talking about the size that you can see from a satellite, what is the size of such a forest, like the smallest forest you can see from a satellite?
We've witnessed some amazing advances in remote sensing technology that now allows us to study pixels, so chunks of land that are maybe 70 by 70 meters.
That's smaller than a soccer field, I think, or more or less a soccer field.
Yeah, so it's really cool. Yeah.
So you can see Central Park, of course, yes.
If Central Park falls in a nice pixel, I guess yes. But if there's a mix of Central Park and then a chunk of urban land, then everything gets a bit blurry. Scientists that are experts in telecommunications, they're absolutely fantastic, but obviously they cannot optimize everything. So they're going to be aiming to maximize the amount of useful information we get from the satellites they send out in space. That's never going to be perfect, obviously.
There are also physical limitations. It's also a problem sometimes with microscopes. People want to look at smaller and smaller stuff, but if the photon that you're using disturbs your sample, you cannot see it anymore.
Exactly. By observing anything, we're changing it.
Anything?
Yeah. How can you be sure that what you're observing wouldn't be the same if you weren't observing it?
No, that's very true, but that's very interesting to think about as well. How do you know it changes, but how do you know it doesn't change?
It's the conundrum that scientists have to deal with.
Yeah, it brings us to the double slit experiment and physics.
That's for someone else in your show.
Yeah.
To follow up the previous question, for practical reason, what we can choose if you want to have plants at home that can absorb more carbon and to provide more oxygen. Is there any practical advice here? Like maybe the plant behind your room?
Yeah. Yeah.
First of all, I'd say think about the type of environment where your domestic plant is going to be living. Like, is it a nice sunny terrace with a lot of humidity? Then you can probably afford plants with really big leaves that provide shade and cool down your terrace, and that's fantastic. On the contrary, if you live in an area where it's kind of dry and your outdoor terrace gets a lot of sun all day long, well, you probably want to think of some shrubs that are maybe a bit more prickly, rosemary, things like that. On top of that, you can season your food afterwards. And they provide a little bit of shade, and they are very resistant to the heat and the air dryness. So that's the main issue. Think about where your plant's going to be. And obviously, for us in temperate latitudes, we need to think of cold, frosty temperatures in the winter. Plants aren't meant to live indoors to start with, but they can still make it. So on that sense, I would say probably plants that need a small amount of light to survive, because most of the time they're only going to get direct exposure for an hour or two during the day. And then probably you also want plants that don't grow too fast unless you have a really big home. And probably also, again, that goes back to thinking about the conditions inside your home. Like, do you have heating on, for example, in the winter? That could be a killer for certain species. On the contrary, if you're in a house that is well ventilated, where you barely ever have to turn any type of climate control, then you can probably afford more native species and a much more diverse selection of plants. But one thing that's always fun to have around, in my opinion, it's things like mint, rosemary, thyme, basil, because they're easy and they're tasty and they always look good.
I must also be honest, this plant in the background, I move it around when I do a recording because it's a bit too dark here. But otherwise, I just have a wall behind me. So I was like, I'm going to move a plant there.
And also, unfortunately, I am an expert plant killer. So
I thought you were supposed to save the plants.
yeah, a lot of my experiments involve killing the plants. So yeah, it's funny because I get a lot of questions about like, oh, I have this plant at home and it's going through tough times. Well, I can tell you when it's going to die or how it's going to die. I don't think I can tell you how to save it.
Well, it's a start. I mean...
Because it's not supposed to be indoor, yeah?
Yeah.
It actually also brings up a point. When you grow a plant indoors, you can also find sometimes it's growing faster because it's looking for light or something, but it's also less strong. It's more flexible. And when you put it outside, it breaks immediately. Do you have some insights on that? What is the reason for that, or can you avoid it?
Yeah, for sure. So that's actually a very typical adaptation of plants that are used to variable light environments. I mentioned I work a lot on beech trees, European beech, Fagus sylvatica, which is a really important species in Europe. And if you look at their leaves, they're almost totally flat. They've evolved to maximize light capture. But we can also notice that there are important differences between the leaves that are in the lower part of the canopy and the leaves that are in the top part of the canopy. So the leaves in the lower part of the canopy, they're kind of thin, and the leaves in the top part of the canopy, they're much densely packed and thicker. That's because they have their cells aligned almost vertically with the ones at the top of the canopy because they have a lot of light available. On the contrary, the leaves at the bottom of the canopy, they have their cells placed in a horizontal plane to maximize light capture. So your plant at home growing in a low light environment, it's like that lower canopy leaf trying to maximize light capture. So if you just wanted to grow leaves that are more used to capturing light, then you should put it outside where there's nice exposure while it's still young and it's still forming leaves.
And that's actually, again, an adaptation to capture that carbon dioxide and convert it to sugars.
Exactly.
In terms of absorbing light, I ask whether it's good to clean the leaf of a plant indoor just to maximize their ability to capture light, because sometimes it's dusty, right? Is it helpful?
If that plant was outdoors, it would also be covered in dust eventually, but eventually it would rain and that rain would probably wash away that dust. So yeah, the equivalent would be dusting off your plant, I guess. Yes.
So, and you said you look into climate change and how that affects plants. Do you have some recent insights on that? So you said you looked at the heat waves and that plants can influence the climate when there's at least some water available and we don't reach a threshold when it's too much. Do you have some other insights on that, on how plants affect climate or the other way around?
Yeah, so a lot of the research I've done ever since I started my PhD is on the impact on drought, on plant functioning, on carbon uptake, photosynthesis, and also on transpiration and the ratio between the two of them, water use efficiency. And some research I did earlier in my career, but I think it's very relevant, something we don't think much about, is that plants also respire. They do take up CO2, but they also respire the same way we do.
Respire is lose CO2 again.
Exactly. So we go back to the initial idea. Yeah, sure, plants don't have a heart, they don't have a brain, they don't have lungs, but plants respire. And they respire CO2. The thing is that during the day, the dominant process is photosynthesis and absorption of CO2. But we have to keep in mind that during the day, plants are also producing a little bit of CO2 that is also going out through the stomatal pores. So the rate at which plants produce that CO2 mainly depends on temperature. It also depends on how much sugars are available, for example. And very important, temperatures are getting warmer at night. And at night, when there's no sun, no photosynthesis. The dominant process is respiration. There's only respiration. So there's net emission of CO2 from any vegetated area back into the atmosphere. So if the temperature increases at night, the vegetation is going to be using up a lot more of the CO2 they took up during photosynthesis and use it in respiration and release it back into the atmosphere. And that's going to be something we need to take into account when we do our math. For example, how many hectares of forest we need to plant to offset a certain amount of CO2. So in a way, climate warming, it's going to not only affect the way plants take up CO2, but also the balance. And that's having a huge impact on the actual fluxes of carbon exchange between the vegetation and the atmosphere.
And that respiration is actually to have energy for the plant itself. So it uses some sugars to have energy, but then it releases CO2 again. And because of temperature increase, it actually needs more energy, so it releases more CO2.
Exactly. Yeah. Respiration is a metabolic process, and all metabolic processes are accelerated with temperature because there's more energy available. Molecules move faster, you burn more sugars, you release more CO2. And the plant still needs to keep its cells alive, repair all its membranes, proteins, cell walls, and it needs to grow and it needs to form fruits. And for all those processes, they need to use those sugars, transform them into other molecules that then they use to build different parts of the cell, and that produces CO2.
What is the percentage of the CO2 they release at night in comparison with the CO2 they absorb?
So let's say they took up 100 during photosynthesis, they could release back into the atmosphere up to 60. So the net uptake would only be 40.
Wow, that's against my assumption because I assume they take up almost every single carbon and release only a little.
It's actually huge. It's a huge flux. And obviously that number varies a lot. It can vary from 20 to 90%. So 60, it's a very rough mean for the world. But yeah, it's a huge, huge process. And I haven't been working on plant respiration much in the past few years, but I did quite a bit of work on it from the beginning. And it's absolutely fascinating. And it's not only temperature, it's also water availability. It also depends on how much photosynthesis you did during the day, how much CO2 you will release at night. So yeah, it's absolutely fascinating research topic with a huge impact for us.
You said that temperature change determines how much forests we need to plant, for example, to compensate a certain production of CO2. But I assume there's a difference between the uptake of carbon dioxide of a young forest and an older forest. How do you take that into account?
That brings me to the results of a project I also participated in. So young forests take up carbon and grow much faster than old growth forests. And a lot of our models that we used to predict the amount of carbon that the vegetation would be able to absorb were based on experiments that had been performed on very young plantations. And then a bunch of very smart scientists, among which there was some of the people I work with during my postdoc in Australia, they said, hold on a second, what happens in all growth forests? Do they really take up CO2 at the same rate? And they set up a whole ecosystem experiment in an old growth forest. So keeping the forest intact, they managed to build a structure around it to fumigate the forest to simulate an elevated CO2 atmosphere. To compare then what happens inside the plots where they were simulating an elevated CO2 atmosphere with other plots that were experiencing a natural atmosphere with ambient CO2 concentrations, and then compare the growth rates and the rates of photosynthesis between plots that were experiencing an elevated CO2 atmosphere and a non-elevated CO2 atmosphere. And the results were very surprising because we saw that all growth forests definitely do not take up CO2 at the same rate as those young plantations. And they have much higher ratios of photosynthesis to respiration. So yeah, sure, there's a little bit of extra photosynthesis happening under that elevated CO2, but a lot of that extra carbon is simply being respired back into the atmosphere.
When we're speaking like net uptake minus a release, do young forests take up more CO2 or not really?
If we do the calculation relative to the standing biomass that we have at a forest, then yes, a young forest will take up more CO2 relative to the standing biomass than an old growth forest. But that young forest eventually will become an old growth forest and plateau. So the best way of offsetting CO2 emissions, it's actually keeping old growth forests intact because they are a huge carbon reservoir.
There's a lot of advertisement about biofuel to save the planet. Is it true? Because when we use biofuel in our engine, it will also emit carbon. So is it just a cycle?
So that kind of brings me back to how we started this conversation a little bit. It's all going to depend on where that biofuel is being produced, where you're using it with respect to where it was produced. And I would argue that the best way of offsetting our emissions is basically to reduce energy use to start with. But then again, if we're at a situation that we're using biofuel that comes from a sustainable crop that is not far from where it's being produced, that sustainable crop, it's planted not, for example, where there was a native forest. Because if we cut down a native forest to plant biofuel producing crop, then we're definitely not being efficient. So it's a complicated answer, but initially biofuel use is not bad on its own, but the problem is that we cannot embrace it as a definite solution because we cannot just clear cut all of our land and turn it into biofuel production.
Right. And the same as the electric car, yeah? It's not clear-cut answer, actually.
Exactly.
So actually our main focus should be to reduce our energy needs rather than trying to solve the problems we're creating.
Yeah.
So Teresa, you're in academia and you have been for a while. I assume you want to stay in academia, but what do you like about the world of academia so much?
The creative thinking. I absolutely love the thrill to just be motivated by figuring out how nature works. And that's something you cannot do outside academia. If you're in a private business or if you're into teaching, then your ultimate goal is going to be very different. The goal of producing knowledge just for the value of it, I think that's a huge motivation for me. And that's something I cannot find elsewhere.
Is it also being the first to discover something, or doesn't that really play a factor, just the fact that you can find answers to questions?
Posing the questions is sometimes more difficult than answering the questions, actually. But yeah, obviously finding something for the first time, it's exciting, but just the little Eureka moments you have along your career when you're struggling with a data set to understand a certain tiny little process. And then all of a sudden one day, all the pieces fall into place. That's so rewarding. Also transmitting that knowledge. I enjoy very, very much working with colleagues, with students. I've now transitioned to a position where I have a bit more responsibility as mentor, and that's a lot of fun. And it's actually fascinating to see how we all have different ways of learning and thinking and assimilating processes. And it's just great because you need to sometimes take a step back and look at the person in front of you. It's like, oh, no, you're actually thinking about the problem in a totally different way. And that's going to take us somewhere very interesting.
Teaching or helping people and working in academia, was that something you wanted to do as a child, or did you have other dreams?
I didn't realize I wanted to become a scientist until I was like 17, 18 years old, honestly. I was always interested by technical sciences, math, chemistry. I enjoyed learning about those subjects and I thought it was just fun. And then eventually it came to me one day. It was like, oh, hold on, I can do that. I could be a scientist one day. But that didn't hit me like when I was 6 or anything. No, it was a bit more of a mature decision.
You said 17, 18, that's still quite early.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
If you weren't a scientist, what would you be?
Actually, I'm going to give you a very unorthodox answer, okay? And I guess a lot of scientists would tell you like, oh, I'd be a data analyst or I'd be a teacher. To be honest, I think I would have a beauty cabin.
Okay, that's an unconventional answer. That's true. And why?
Because I think it's a very rewarding job and I enjoy watching people go into a place and have a good time and come out feeling better because their skin is shinier or their nails look good. And I think that would be rewarding.
Yeah, of course, of course. And actually, Ahmad, if you were a scientist, do you know a subject you would want to be a scientist in, or what would you do?
After this discussion, I'm interested in knowing more about plants. Yes. It's
Yes,
fascinating.
great.
Yeah, there are so many things that I don't know about plants and how plants behave and everything. So much to learn about it.
How did you become a writer? Because you were already a pretty successful journalist. And then at some point you were like, I'm going to be a writer, or was it always there?
Well, at some point, I think I need to give more than to take more. And my teacher in my Islamic boarding school used to tell us that your reason actually is not to take something, but to give something more. And I try to find my way to share more. What can I share more? I don't have much money to share. I don't have enough power, but I like writing. So maybe from my writing, I can share stories. And stories can touch people. If you write from your heart, it will touch hearts of your reader. So that's not one-time decision. It's a long and deep thinking of finding my mission, something like that.
And actually, Teresa, I have read his book, The Land of Five Towers, which is available in English, and it's great. So if you love to read, then I really recommend it.
I've actually already put it on my list. So yeah, I checked that out. Yeah.
Thank you.
This is about the end of the episode. But Teresa, do you have a take-home message for our listeners?
Well, I really like the last few thoughts that Ahmed shared with us about like, oh, I realized how little I knew about how plants function. And I would like your listeners to think of how many things plants are doing for us when they walk through a forest, when they drive by a field, when they're laying on the grass and enjoy the atmosphere around them. It's all fascinating and it's a perfect machinery. It's there providing us with so many good things that we so often overlook. And they need a lot more attention.
I agree. I think Ahmed does as well.
Yeah.
This was the 7th episode of Apple Finch Pudding. I want to thank Teresa Gimeno for the information and Ahmad Fuadi for the questions. Let's meet again for the next episode of Apple Finch Pudding.